Hey folks, Tim Newman with Softlight Studios, and it's time for another installment in our ongoing series, Living with Lightroom. Today, we're going to take a look at the detail panel in Lightroom, which is Lightroom's sharpening tool. And interesting enough, the detail panel in Lightroom drives the detail tool in Adobe Camera Raw underneath. So when you've learned one, you've essentially learned the other. Now, the other day, we just did our video on the Smart Sharpen filter in Photoshop, and that's one of the reasons why we're taking a look at the detail panel today, just to kind of round out the picture, if you will. The other thing that I think is important to understand about these two tools is I see the detail panel in Lightroom as my global out-of-camera sharpening tool, if you will. It kind of affects the image as a whole. Now, there are ways of dialing this down and getting it to be a little more focused, but that's the way I see it in my workflow. And then I think of the Smart Sharpen tool as the tool that allows me to really get focused in on specific areas in the image that I want to add sharpening to via either the controls that exist within the filter or using it on a copied layer of the image and then applying a mask to mask out areas that I don't want to be affected by that tool. So I think with this video today, we will round out our understanding of both of those tools and give you a good set of tools to apply for your global sharpening out of camera and then your specific sharpening when you're finishing up your edits on your work. Let's take a look in Lightroom. Here we are in Lightroom in the Develop module with an image already selected that we can use for our exploration of the detail panel today. Now, it is fair to say that Lightroom has offered sharpening and noise reduction in both the luminance and color areas within the image for quite some period of time. But it is also fair to say that in the most recent couple of releases, these tools have significantly matured and offer a ton of subtle yet powerful features that are worth exploring. Now, as I had said in the introduction, I think of this as my pre-editing sharpening tool. This is something that I do more or less globally to the image before I go in and do my localized edits in Photoshop and then decide what areas need to be specifically sharpened to finish up my work with the image. All right, before we dive into the detail panel here, there's a couple of things that I want to point out because I think they're valuable pieces of information and they will improve your interaction with the set of tools that are available here. First of all, we are starting off with the detail panel in a state that we very rarely see, which is we have sharpening and all of its controls, and noise reduction and all of its controls dialed back to 0. And we did that on purpose because I really want you to see the effect of these sliders as they are put into place. The next thing I want to talk about here is this navigation panel here, which allows you to drag around the image so you can see specific areas in the image to see how sharpening is working there. The other thing I want you to see is right up here, if you see this little target symbol, if you click on this, this will give you a set of crosshairs, and then you can simply say, I'd like to work in this area, and that will bring that into focus over here in the navigator panel and lock it in for you. You notice without locking that in, if I just come over here, I see everywhere in the frame. I'll turn this back on here. And it doesn't stay locked in. So if I say, oh, right here, these door handles, I want to lock in there, I just click on that, that turns that guy off and you're locked into that place. So that is a handy little tool to have available to you and know how it works. So we're going to just come over here on these rivets and lock in there because I think that'll be a good area to judge and see how the sharpening we're doing is working. One last thing that I want to point out here, and this is one of those little hidden gems, if you will, in Lightroom that you've probably seen up in the basic control panel, but it works here in the detail panel as well, is on the Mac the Option key and on Windows the Alt key. And if I hold that down while I am operating a slider, I get a wholly different view of the scene and I can see the overall sharpening that's happening to the image. Once I dial this up, if I'm holding it down, I can actually see the effect of the radius control. I can see the effect of the detail control. I can even see how they combine together, and then I can even see the masking that's happening here in a very clear-cut way. So a lot of times when you're sharpening, one of the complaints that people have is, I don't really have a good handle on what the effect I'm seeing with these sliders is. And by holding that Option key down on the Mac or that Alt key down on Windows, it makes it really obvious what the effect is of those sliders. So I think that's really a cool feature to know that it's there and to be able to employ that as you're going through sharpening here in an image. So real quickly, I'm going to set all these guys back to 0, and the only way I can set them back to 0 is if I have an amount dialed in. As soon as I take an amount all the way out, then these guys lock out and they are turned off. So we're back to kind of our starting position here, and now we'll start to explore this tool in detail. So the first thing that we want to take a look at here is the amount slider. And as you dial this up to really extremes, you can start to see things happening here in the image. I think if you hold down the Alt Option key and you go into this black and white mode, especially if I'm looking up here at the roof, for example, of that little utility shed out there, I can see that kind of crunchy snow up there starting to take on a little bit of additional sharpness. Once I've dialed an amount in, then I can start operating this radius slider. And the way the radius slider works is very similar to the Smart Sharpen tool in Photoshop, in that it decides based on the sharpening that's already been done, which is essentially done on clusters of light and dark pixels touching one another. It then spreads out the radius of that sharpening and says, okay, if the sharpening is happening here, start to spread out a certain number of pixels in each direction. So in this case, we're spreading the maximum here, 3 pixels in each direction from where the sharpening happened, and then of course the other direction is none. And I think you can see that as you start to dial that radius up, the sharpening becomes a little more pronounced there and a little more obvious. Okay. Now the detail slider here actually looks for micro details, if you will, or smaller detail areas in here, things like wisps of hair and little thin twigs and trees and leaves and stuff that's really small, and it tries to embellish sharpening in those areas. And then the interesting slider here down at the end of the sharpening panel is this masking slider. So the masking slider here really works kind of like having a mask in Photoshop. Areas that are masked off aren't going to receive the sharpening effect, and areas that aren't masked off are going to receive the sharpening effect. Now here it's a little more global in nature, but as I leave this over here at 0, everything is going to get sharpened. And as I slowly move my way to the right, you can see that Lightroom is starting to really focus down on smaller and smaller areas, really more contrasty areas where it's going to apply that sharpening. So here, I don't know, 70%, you start to see that it's really pretty well defined where the sharpening is going to go. And quite frankly, if you're doing sharpening in Lightroom and you're not using the mask, you're really taking the giant amateur swipe at sharpening and just doing the whole image kind of indiscriminately. So there you go. There's sharpening in this image with those 4 sliders dialed into place, and I think you'll agree the Option/Alt key really helps to make it clear the effects of what you're doing here with the sharpening tool. Now, after I've done a little bit of sharpening, one of the things that I like to do is take a look at the before and after effects of that sharpening and get an idea of what generally overall is my sharpening doing. And the before and after key is the / key up here right underneath the delete key on the keyboard, and you can see here's the before mode, and you notice it up here in the upper right hand corner, and there's the after mode. So I can kind of look back and forth real quickly. I can also zoom in and use the before and after, and one of the things that I can quickly note here is while there are some areas that are clearly sharpening up, I'm also inducing a little bit of noise up here in doing that. And so this is where we want to start thinking about adding the noise reduction slider into the program. Okay, so now that we've increased sharpening, we really need to be thinking about what to do with noise reduction. Now, the Luminance sliders are very interesting in that they work in very specific ways, kind of in conjunction with one another. Luminance as a slider overall is looking at stark differences between individual pixels, and it's looking for real wide ranges of tonality. in between individual pixels that are sitting next to one another, and it tries to crunch that tonality down a little bit so it's not quite as big a gap in terms of tonality. And you'll notice as we move this slider to the right to this 100% mark, we start to see, especially up in this grain elevator, for example, we start to lose the detail in there. If we go back to 0, we start to see the noise come back. So there's a sweet spot there in the center, if you will, that really looks better. And that's actually the rub with sharpening and noise reduction, in that sharpening increases noise, but noise reduction decreases sharpening. So the two are directly at odds with one another, and it's always a balancing act between the sharpening panel and the noise reduction panel, what you want to do here. Now the detail panel works similar to the luminance panel, except that it is looking for what I would say, for lack of a better term, is medium-sized clusters of pixels that are at contrast odds with one another. So as we dial that up and down, you'll notice that we're not losing detail in as many areas, but we are dropping noise out kind of a little bit smoother in larger areas, kind of up here in the 60s or 70s. You kind of see it in the panel right there. And then last but not least, there's the contrast slider, which is kind of one notch up in terms of looking at sizes of grouped pixels, and this is looking at larger groups of pixels. And the adjustment in the contrast slider, if you really study it for a while, you'll notice that larger shapes become a little better defined when the contrast slider is pushed up a little ways. So these sliders do a really good job of kind of working at a micro contrast level, kind of a midterm contrast level, and a large scale contrast level. Now the last set of sliders that we want to look at in here, and it's not entirely likely that we're going to see a whole lot of this in this image. Let's maybe zoom in, I don't know, maybe 3 to 1, and then start to push the color slider up. And you notice as we're pushing this up that colors become a little more uniform. They're not all over the place like they might be without it. I'm going to try to find a nice dark area here that we might see some color pixels in. This is a pretty clean sensor on this camera, so we may not see this quite as clearly with an older camera that has a little more color noise in there. But pushing these sliders up should take control over those hot color pixels in the image and make those uniform with the pixels that are surrounding them. Much like the noise reduction sliders up here, the color noise reduction sliders here work kind of in the same fashion. This is really a micro adjustment on a pixel by pixel comparison basis, looking for really wide ranging gaps in color rendition. This is kind of looking at small groupings of pixels, and this is looking at larger groupings of pixels, if you will. So this is definitely very akin to the way this operates here. Again, all of these sliders, by the way, are affected by the Alt Option key as well. Let's zoom out here so you can see Luminance does that, Detail does that, Contrast does that. Now, I wouldn't expect to see a grayscale rendition of the color sliders, because what you're really trying to see is shifts in colors. So it makes sense that these three sliders here, the Alt Option key, does not have any display effect on those. So there's the detail panel in Photoshop, and I think the combination of all of those sliders allows you to really carefully dial in the changes that you want in the picture in terms of sharpening, and then the corresponding noise reduction to go along with it. Well, that's it, folks. There you have it, the detail panel in Lightroom. Plus, if you look at our other video on the Smart Sharpen filter, you have a well-rounded set of sharpening and noise reduction tools for your images and your editing workflow. Hope you enjoyed this video and you found it useful. Don't forget to mash that red subscriber button down below so you can see more videos from us as they come out on a regular basis. And remember, as we always say, learning equals skills, practice equals mastery. We'll see you out there.